Mr. Howard, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say something briefly. I just had a sandwich out there that was full of chilli or something or other, so I've now got 2 glasses of water in case I need that. A delicious lunch, and thank you so much for having me here. I'd like to say what an honour it is to be asked to speak today at the National Press Club for the 4th Howard Government Retrospective Conference to discuss cartooning during the Howard years. As a bit of a background, I began as the political cartoonist for the Sydney Daily Mirror. Does anybody remember that? Yes. Oh wow, all the arms. 33 years ago I began as the cartoonist there. 3 years into the Hawke government. The Daily Mirror became the Daily Telegraph Mirror for a while and then reverted back to being the Daily Telegraph, and I've been there ever since. So I've had a ringside seat as a political cartoonist for the entirety of the Howard years. When Tom approached me to discuss Mr. Howard and the cartoons drawn about him during his time as PM, I was delighted, of course, thrilled to bits, especially as he's the guest of honour here today. But in the excitement, I forgot something, a rather important detail, that unless you're the cartoonist for Pravda, where it's a wise idea to draw flattering depictions of Vladimir Putin every day, the tradition for cartoonists in Australia has been to draw our political leaders in the worst possible light. We draw them only when we think something is wrong, when things are on the nose, and we make them look as silly as possible, compromised in the most outrageously unfair predicaments imaginable, which places me in a rather awkward position. So, Mr. Howard, you and I will be sharing something personal today. This next little while will be absolutely excruciating for both of us. You'll be revisiting old cartoons as you would recurring nightmares. And I'll be presenting them to you fully expecting a shoe thrown at me in the style received by George W. Bush. Here's my first slide. Did it go? Aha. So we're going to have a bit of an old-time slideshow here today, everyone. I'd like this presentation to be informal, as comfortable and relaxed. That's a term I just invented, so I thought I'd throw that in. But just before we begin, I'd like to outline my thinking today. I'd been given a vast blank canvas on which I can paint a cartoonist's impression of the political landscape during the Howard years. In retrospect, a unique and phenomenal time in Australia's history. The events that unfolded during John Howard's 11-year tenure range from the wonderful and wondrous, the centenary of Federation, the unforgettable Sydney Olympics, to the contentious, native title, Tampa, waterfront reform, the GST, work choices, East Timor, the Republic referendum, to the unexpected and the terrible, Port Arthur, the Bali bombing, September 11. So what we're going to do is have a bit of a stroll down memory lane to a time even before the Howard years, to have a look at when cartoonists were first presented with the challenge of drawing a former Earlwood public school boy who materialised onto the federal stage to eventually become the second longest serving PM in Australia. And then we'll have a run through some of the cartoons I've managed to find. Okay. The long period we term the Howard years was bookended between the heady days of the self-described Placido Domingo of Australian politics, Paul Keating, and the ill-fated experiment that was Kevin Rudd. Indeed, as far as cartoonists were concerned, the Howard years were a spectacular ride. And it seemed as though John Howard's reign would never end. By his 11th year as PM, his caricature had been drawn so often by so many, it had been refined to a kind of shorthand. In many ways, his face became something of an emoji, long before there were emojis. But John Howard had arrived as Prime Minister in 1996, fully formed as a political cartoon character. From the moment Paul Keating handed over the keys to Kirribilli House, his caricature was already well honed and readers were long familiar as to who the big bifocals and the eyebrows were all about. He'd been on the political landscape for an awfully long time. Yet, as far as how John Howard's caricature developed is something worth exploring. I was particularly keen to go on an archaeological dig to try and trace some sort of linear evolution process buried somewhere in the tar pits of his earlier political life. John Howard is certainly one of the most readily recognised political figures in Australia, but this wasn't always the case. He truly arrived on cartoonists' radar in 1977, when he was appointed Treasurer in Malcolm Fraser's government, replacing the outgoing Philip Lynch. Now, have a look at this. This is one of the earliest representations of John Howard I could find. It's a cartoon drawn by the late Larry Pickering depicting the deposed Treasurer Philip Lynch pleading for his old job. In fact, he's saying, "But handling money is the only job I know." And Malcolm Fraser says, "We've created a position for you, Phil. Yeah, I'll have 2 egg and lettuce," which is a really lovely cartoon. In the room behind is the small and slightly obscured face of the new Treasurer peering from behind the door. Now, Pickering's employed a few old cartoonist tricks here. Mr. Howard's drawn as far away as possible, suggesting Pickering wasn't yet comfortable or at least confident with the likeness. And, just so the reader knows exactly who the new Treasurer is, his name is plastered across the door, Treasurer Howard. In those days, long before the internet, where now you can instantly drum up countless images of just about anyone, cartoonists would desperately try to hunt down photographs of new politicians in a newspaper's photo library, photos which very often didn't exist. So likenesses were often approximations from grabs on TV news or from life drawing in the press gallery in Canberra. These are other early depictions of John Howard by Patrick Cook and the late Ron Tanberg. And clearly there was a John Howard character emerging, a simplified representation of the new Treasurer the readers would soon recognise and grow accustomed to. Now, from a cartoonist perspective, the combination of Malcolm Fraser and John Howard as a duo was made in heaven, not in a Laurel and Hardy sense, but more of a kind of not quite Batman and Robin relationship. The towering patrician old-time Conservative leader, prone to landing the pair in trouble, and the trusty sidekick who was always under pressure to find a way out. As in this beautiful Patrick Cook cartoon, Fraser appears as a blundering giant crashing around in the jungle, presumably lost, and John Howard is following, trying to figure it all out. And if you have a look, Malcolm Fraser there is saying to John, he's saying, "I've been a conservationist since 1959. He says, "Conserving what? 1959. It's a really lovely old cartoon. Okay. Yet for cartoonists, it was the disparity in size between the PM and his Treasurer that cemented the trademark John Howard cartoon character for his entire political career as being 3 feet tall. As you can see in this photo, John Howard is no shorter than anyone else in the room, but standing next to Malcolm Fraser, who's just a smidge under 2 metres tall, made him seem infinitesimal. In fact, anyone standing next to Malcolm Fraser was instantly dwarfed. I'm about 6 feet tall on the dot, and I served on the National Commission for the commemoration of the Anzac Centenary with Malcolm Fraser 10 years ago. And even in his mid-80s, I had a crick neck from looking up at him, he's that tall. So I can imagine when Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser were in the room together, everyone must have looked infinitesimal. Politicians are fun to draw, and I have one here, The Beginner's Guide to How to Draw John Howard. Only days before Prime Minister Bob Hawke's passing this year, a survey by the Australian Cartoonists Association as to which Prime Minister was the most fun to draw revealed Bob Hawke in first place with John Howard hot on his heels, and you can see why. As a rule of thumb, there are 3 components in drawing Mr. Howard. His glasses are the windscreens to the soul, and the lips that have a Michelin tyre pressure rating of 35 pounds per square inch. But it's the handlebar eyebrows that are sometimes the size of water buffalo horns that do all the work in the cartoon. No matter what Mr. Howard's mood, if he's delighted, angry, content, euphoric, outraged or alarmed, a simple adjustment of the eyebrows north or south gets the message across every time. Okay. For the coalition, this lovely cartoon, isn't it? For the coalition, Ron Tandberg. For the coalition, the years in the wilderness after Malcolm Fraser's loss to Bob Hawke in 1983 were a seemingly endless game of musical chairs, and for the media, the battle for the title as leader between Andrew Peacock and John Howard was terrific theatre. Until this. The Bulletin's front page in December 1988. Mr 18%, why on earth does this man bother? While it's an outstanding headline, in my opinion, this front page cemented in the mind of Australia's media, particularly the cartoonists, that John Howard was completely finished, washed up, an anachronism, a relic of the Fraser years. And before long, he was once again ousted as the leader of the opposition. It was here he made his famous statement about the possibility of his return. That would be like Lazarus with a triple bypass. Interestingly, I might just point out, Mr Howard is here today and the Bulletin is dead and buried. I thought you might like to... But in time, successive Liberal leaders keeled over. Andrew Peacock imploded, John Hewson was poisoned by a birthday cake, and Alexander Downer came to a stocking end. I thought it was all right. Lazarus did indeed once again rise from the dead. And if you can't see this, it's a lovely Mark Knight cartoon. It's the Liberal leadership morgue, and we have everybody with their toe tags on there. We've got Peacock, and we've got Hewson, and we've got Downer at the end there. And here is Mr Howard. He's got up again and he's marching out the door, which is just a lovely cartoon. And so the 1996 election was set. Yet there was no new blood here. Instead, two old-time street fighters who knew their way around. And it was no surprise to Australians that John Howard, once Mr 18%, would wipe the floor with Paul Keating. It was only the media that had completely misread public sentiment and stood absolutely gobsmacked, blindsided, struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Now, this is a Peter Nicholson cartoon from The Australian. And we have Mr Howard here and he's painting. There's a little sign and it says, Australia's top miniaturist. Designed to show the stark differences in vision between successive governments. Keating out the back with his unwieldy big picture in the wheelie bin, with the new PM daubing on a postage stamp sized canvas. Journalists were bracing themselves for a return to the 1950s. And Bill Leake. Peter Reith's declaration of war on the waterfront was certainly eyebrow-raising. Australians have been saying since the first convict stumbled down the gangplank at Sydney Cove, the waterfront was crooked and someone needed to sort them out. It's just that nobody thought anyone was actually going to do it. Another Mark Knight cartoon. A key feature of the Coalition's 1996 election campaign was the promise of a ministerial code of conduct holding MPs accountable for their actions. Needless to say, like the Titanic, it didn't survive its maiden voyage. And an Alan Moyer cartoon from the Sydney Morning Herald. The tragedy that was the Port Arthur massacre occurred only moments into the new Howard government. The issue of gun control became more confused and convoluted by the hour. And we have a fellow sitting at the kitchen table with a rifle in parts and a pistol there, and his wife holding a baby, and he's telling her, I need them, the guns, to protect us against people like me. A cartoon of mine. It was a time of panic, of sorrow and blame, requiring steely resolve. To tackle this issue head on was unlike anything anyone had ever succeeded in doing before, and it was potentially dangerous. The nation was heading into a dark place. This is a Bill Leake cartoon on the national gun laws, and it drew the ire of the shooting community. And it has these fellas here with their baseball caps and armed to the teeth with bandoliers, and there's a four-wheel drive loaded with guns, and this fellow's reading a newspaper with the headline National Gun Laws, and he's saying, these laws discriminate against decent, hard-working Australians who like blowing the heads off small, furry animals. But for me, and this is one of mine, the image of the PM wearing what was clearly a bulletproof vest under his jacket, addressing a hostile crowd of outraged gun owners, suggested we were entering a new and unforeseen, ugly era for Australia. We know John Howard didn't want to wear the vest and was only following advice from his security detail, but this was not the Australia I knew. And I have Mr. Howard here, and he's saying, remind me, is this still Australia? And the place is just loaded with people with firearms and angry crowds and helicopters and bulletproof vests. The perils of Pauline. An unexpected consequence of the 1996 election, former Queensland fish and chip shop owner and disendorsed Liberal Pauline Hanson was able to drum up support from quarters where previously those voices had not been heard. There were questions at the time as to whether or not she'd been playing the race card. And I have her here like the Pied Piper, with, on the flute there it says One Nation, and all sorts of people are coming out from all sorts of dark places. Another Peter Nicholson cartoon, The Blind Leading the Blind. Pauline Hanson, the new star on the national stage, was given a free voice thanks to a new style of federal government that encouraged free speech, whatever it might be, and they fell into line. It's a really lovely cartoon, the way it's drawn, and you can see almost all of the cabinet there following Pauline Hanson, who's leading them over the edge of a cliff. A Michael Atchison cartoon, The Horse Designed by the Committee. The GST had long been regarded as the unstable gelignite of politics ever since it blew up in John Hewson's face, costing him the unlosable election. After assuring everyone the whole idea of a GST was dead and buried, the PM managed to get it across the line with the help of Democrats leader Meg Lees, which moves into David Rowe again, and he's shouting, "It lives!" With a whopping jolt of electricity, the GST in the form of Meg Lees has risen again, not quite like Lazarus, but more like something like Frankenstein's monster in this cartoon. And it's a really lovely, lovely David Rowe cartoon. But Mark Knight's cartoon takes the spot. Meg Lees, she's reclining, satisfied, had a wonderful time, and I love Mr. Howard there. I don't think it's a YouTube channel I'd watch. But she says on her telephone, "He's found my GST spot." No doubt about it, Mr. Howard sure seems to have the touch. But the GST might have been given the green light, but it was very much a work in progress here. And here's Mr. Howard trying to sell it over there, and he said, "It'll be ready for you shortly. We're just putting the final touches to it." And here's John Anderson and Joe Hockey, and they're all sitting there with a whole bunch of parts ready to put it together. But finally, the GST is on the loose. This is a Bill Leake cartoon. And the GST, it's out there with some unmistakable DNA, if you'd say. Bill Leake told me about this cartoon. As soon as the GST came in, he was drawing Mr. Howard's lip 10% bigger. And a Jeff Pryor cartoon. This is the bus to reconciliation is taking the scenic route. And there's Amanda Vanstone, and the bus, as the door opens, and they're in the middle of the wilderness, and she's saying, "Where in the hell are we?" Mr. Howard's saying, "About halfway." I think that's really lovely. And another Peter Nicholson. And Pat Dodson's growing tired of waiting for the bus. I love this idea, and it says at the bottom, "Waiting for John Howard." I just love the idea of just deploying that beard in such a visual manner. Here's an interesting one. In 2004, John Howard, a long walker himself, met with Aboriginal long walker Michael Long, who'd walked the long way from Melbourne to Canberra. And the caption at the bottom says "The Long Walk," and there's Mr. Howard opening the door, which you did indeed. You went to visit him, which is a lovely thing. Here we go. Another Peter Nicholson, moving on to Timor. The PM lays to rest the old East Timor policy, a move no one else had ventured to undertake. Which moves on to the Republic, an Alan Moyer cartoon, which is interesting. The Republic and John Howard's vision for Australia. Very cruel, I would say, Mr. Howard. He must have been spitting white-hot Weet-Bix across the table every morning when these things would pop up. But Alan Moyer went through a phase there of drawing Mr. Howard with just one eye in the middle of his head. But I think people feel a bit different, mostly different about that today. And of course, Fiona Katowska's Battle Hymn of the Republic. I say appointed, you say elected, I say elected, you say appointed, appointed, elected, and Mr. Howard says, let's call the whole thing off, which I think is just a lovely cartoon. Battle Hymn of the Republic. But I love this. This is a Mark Knight cartoon. With the SAS deployed on the MV Tampa, Pauline Hanson finds her dream man. You've moved on since Meg Lee's, Mr. Howard, I can see this. And it's such a lovely drawing, and just, I love the sort of six-pack and the hairy chest and the tattoo that says "Who dares win?" And Pauline Hanson says, "Oh, let me run my fingers through that adorable hairy chest." It's a rather fetching picture. And this, conversely, is John Spooner from the Melbourne Age, who said this is how a refugee should behave. A different take on it altogether. And of course, Jeff Pryor, Mr. Howard here, busy at work with a revolver in a glass case, and it says, "In case of unwelcome messages, break glass." And back to Bill Leake. There's a lot of Mr. Howard in the bed cartoons going in here. It's a good thing. And of course, John Howard's remarkable relationship with the United States, in particular with George W. Bush. And Mr. Howard says, trusting, caring, mutually satisfying. And George Bush says, "I'll still respect you in the morning." The State of the Union. Very much a Bill Leake cartoon of its time. It's interesting about Bill Leake because he was such a rusted-on left-winger. Centrist thinking was impossible for him. He just could not do it. Things were extreme. Bill was passionate about everything. He would be passionate. If he went to the beach, he'd be passionate about the sand or the water or the towel or whatever it was of the day. But he had very, very, very strong views about the left, and he absolutely could not abide conservative politics, conservative politicians and their apparatchiks. But in time, he changed. And I know Mr. Howard and Bill Leake became very firm friends. And even the day before Bill died, Mr. Howard spoke to him on the telephone. And I said to Bill once, "Did you ever think that you'd become friends with John Howard?" And he said straight out, "He is a great man." That's what he said. And once upon a time, I could never imagine him ever saying that. So here's another wartime cartoon here from Peter Nicholson on the Australian. Excuse me. As the conflict unfolded, cartoonists geared up for war. And here we have George W. Bush, and he's saying to Mr. Howard and Alexander Downer, "Walkies, you want to go walkies?" And this is the thinking of how a lot of cartoonists on the left were handling this situation. There are a series in here which I'm not going to comment on because they are of their time and of their opinions, but they're worth putting in. So have a look at this. Kathy Wilcox from the Sydney Morning Herald. The train rolling through peace and plunging into war. You missed our stop. Of course, another Bill Leake cartoon which we thought was all quite hilarious at the time, but help the war effort, National Brown Nose Day. Ron Tandberg, a grim cartoon, that's for sure. And Alan Moyer again, parachutes. I thought you brought the parachutes in the Iraq War. But despite the vagaries of war, John Howard always remained a constant. Renowned for his strident walking every morning, replete in his Aussie tracksuit through wind and hail and sleet and snow, on his 65th birthday, the only place he wasn't walking was from the office, much to Peter Costello's despair. If you have a look at this, a lovely Mark Knight cartoon, and you can see Mr. Howard walking under the Harbour Bridge, walking in front of the White House, in front of Houses of Parliament, along a beach, through the snow like a snowplough, and then finally at his birthday and he says, "I ain't walking." Just a lovely cartoon. And someone who would challenge for the office of Prime Minister was the new kid on the block, Mark Latham. And for a moment, he looked like a younger, fresher, perhaps even more viable alternative. And here he is, a David Rowe cartoon, and here's Mr. Howard hanging out a big old pair of grey underpants. And here's Mark Latham holding these leopard skins, G-string briefs, and he's going, "G'day, Grandad," and he says, "Bloody whippersnapper," at the bottom like that. So that's what the thinking was when Mark Latham appeared on the scene. But of course, it changed rather vigorously. It was this unexpected moment, and of course we've been seeing the famous photograph here on the screens all afternoon, which I think are quite incredible. It was a more than awkward handshake as the pair brushed past each other that instantly shook voters' intrigue about Mark Latham. And it was a handshake so vigorous, it ended up shaking Mark Latham completely to bits. And this is a lovely Sean Leigh cartoon from the Brisbane Courier Mail. But it was inevitable that after 11 years, Australia's second longest Prime Ministership would come to an end, and not because of any particular reason. The electorate had grown so comfortable and relaxed, they thought they'd have a fling with something new, and we all know how that worked out. So, there we have it. In closing, I'd like to say what an extraordinary ride it was for any cartoonist to be in the driver's seat during the Howard years, and I'd like to thank you all for sitting through this adventure with me. But from a cartoonist perspective, just so you know, I do have two regrets. And the regrets are that Peter Costello and Tony Abbott never joined forces to make an Abbott and Costello government. And the other was that Anthony Albanese never became the Minister for the Arts. I was never able to draw the cartoon, he doesn't know his arts from his elbow. Can I just throw the floor open? Any questions that anybody would like to ask? At all? No, not at all? Yes?
When did Bill Leake become switch political allegiances?
Yeah, I can tell you about that. So the question was, when did Bill Leake switch political allegiances? So I think basically there's an interesting theory that I have on this. And I think one of the reasons that, we had reigns of prime ministers that ran like dynasties, like the Ming dynasty or the Meiji dynasty. They went on and on. There were the Whitlam years, the Fraser years, the Hawke Keating years, and the Howard years. And you could actually join the dots with everybody. Mr. Howard had a link with Malcolm Fraser, and there was the link with Robert Menzies, and that all went back. And the same with Labor. There were links with Keating in the Whitlam government and Hawke, and that all went. You could trace all that. But the arrival of Kevin Rudd smashed that all to bits. It broke that lineage. You couldn't join the dots anymore, which sounded quite inviting, I guess, when it happened. But after a while, people like Bill and myself became frustrated with this idea because Kevin Rudd, what exactly did he stand for? And in the end, he was turfed out. There just wasn't that training, that background, that understanding of Australian politics. There was a lot of bluff and bluster and selfies and interspecificity, whatever you would say, those sorts of things. And Bill could see he was so so much a fan of, ingrained with the Labor Party. His dad was an old-time Labor man. He'd served in the Royal Australian Navy in World War II, and he was, had very poor schooling and was always worried about the exploitation of the workers, and that rubbed off on Bill. But that all went. And what he saw was that Conservative politics was looking after that. And actually, they weren't that bad after all. And it shocked his friends. He lost a lot of friends over that. Hard-bitten left friends that would prop up the bar of the Aurora Hotel in Surrey Hills. They were angry with him and would say the worst things to him. So he just cut it off and started afresh. And it was a little bit like Conservative politics embraced him like he was a Soviet spy coming in from the cold. He was coming in and they thought it was wonderful, and he really championed it to the end, very much so. Yeah.
Perhaps one more question, if there's any.
All right.
Just let me ask though, Warren, was it ever the case though that your paper got complaints about your cartoons in relation to the 25th Prime Minister?
Yes, yes indeed, about the way that I was handling. In fact, I did actually scan in a letter that I found. You find these people, they cut your cartoon out and they scrawl all over it. It's all a bit kind of creepy when it arrives. It's like a ransom note. And I had this cartoon that I'd drawn of Mr. Howard when he visited Indonesia to see Mr. Habibie, I think. And I had Mr. Howard with a shirt on, like a Bali shirt. It had all, the obligatory shirt you get from Bali. But it had all these issues written all over it, about war and Habibie and all sorts of things, Timor. And it was about tactfully handling the Timor issue. And someone had written all over it, "Warren Brown, you are a gutter snipe," it said on there. And then on Mr. Howard's glasses it said, Mr. It said John Howard, we love you, written on the glasses like that. But that would happen, and I think sometimes with the cartoon, you know, it's good to get that. You know, you need to be. A good cartoonist should be equally unfair to everyone. That's what I say. Yeah.
On that note, please thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.